Well, it won't be a surprise to anyone who watches or reads the news that times are tough for many. Rising interest rate is really worrying for those with mortgages, high cost of living due to inflation, redundancies, and more. And with all those financial pressures, it is unsurprising that people's mental health and well-being is affected. And for those who feel hopeless in the situation, usually the breadwinner of the family, which is often men, some may even consider suicide. So we hope that today's session will provide you the context that you are not alone. There are practical steps you can take, and please ask for help rather than feel that all that weight is on your shoulder. Today's guest is Adam, a principal and financial planner at Rutherford Rede, an independent financial advice and wealth management practice. Adam specializes in providing tailored financial planning and investment management services, particularly to those at junctions in their lives, such as those nearing retirement and those wanting to know how much money is enough to be able to make the most of it. He will be talking a little bit about the economic environment, but mostly focusing on what you can do to prepare yourself for it. And then more broadly to think about what you can do with your long-term financial plans. So with that, welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you for rolling out the digital red carpet for me.
So, Adam, I guess the first question is, how did we get here from an economic perspective?
Yeah, and where are we? Well, it won't come to a shock to anyone that's listening that or watching that we are in times of quite high inflation, and we've also seen some quite high or big increases in interest rates over the last period. And because we're leading into an election, the mud's being flung from one side of the political spectrum to the other. And so you'll see each political party essentially blaming the other one for where we are and how we got here. There've also been some big geopolitical events like the war in Ukraine. There's also been some major weather events locally, like the flooding in Auckland and the flooding in Napier. But if you're going to point the cannon at anything in particular and one root cause, and I think that's right, is that I would aim it squarely at COVID and then at our inability as a species effectively to predict the future. And when I say that, the video that comes to my mind as part of this is an interview with Grant Robinson from 2020, just as we were leading in to the COVID pandemic. I can't remember which news channel it was that was asking him, but there's a microphone right in front of him, right at the start of the pandemic, and it's him saying, we're going into a recession, it's going to be big, it's going to be long, people are going to lose jobs, it's going to be bad, and in fact, it's going to be much worse than the global financial crisis. And that was the outlook back just 3 years ago. And COVID was bad, and I don't want to belittle that in any way, because people did lose their lives and people did lose loved ones and people did lose jobs and lose businesses that they'd grown. But economically, what happened and the predictions, well, economically, it wasn't quite as bad as what people thought. And what that meant was if you're a central banker, your job is to try and keep the economy at a good temperature. Basically, if you think of the economy like a bathtub, your job is to try and keep it pretty lukewarm or about where it should be. But you've got this message that COVID's going to make things really bad, and someone's going to put this ice cube or a really big chunk of ice actually in the bathtub. And so Adrian Orr and the central bankers around the world all turned on this hot tap to try and warm up the bathtub, because the ice cube was coming and the ice cube was going to make it really, really cold. And that's a textbook response, I should hastily add. But what happened was the ice cube that made its way into the bath, well, it wasn't as big as what we thought. And what that meant was that the hot tap was running a bit longer than what it probably should have been in hindsight. And so we have this heated economy. And when you're a central banker and you turn the hot tap on, what that means is you drop interest rates and you increase the money supply. And when you need to slow down the economy or cool it down again, I mean, what options do you have? You've got the cold tap. You need to turn the cold tap on and try and raise interest rates, decrease the money supply so that the economy gets back to something more tepid. And where we are now hopefully is that, well, Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand thinks that we've had the cold tap on long enough that we've turned it off. So there's hopefully no more interest rate rises, but we're still waiting for the cold water to spread throughout the bathtub to merge with the warm water or the hot water to try and get us back to where we need to be. So a long way of saying it won't come as a shock to anyone that we're in a high interest rate environment, or much higher than what we have been, and mostly it's been caused by COVID and the response to COVID.
And as we sort of come into the side of the conversation around what you're seeing in terms of the impact of basically the rising interest rates, the post-COVID hangover, I guess you want to probably do your caveat around what you're going to discuss, but it'd be good to kind of have you frame up, in terms of, obviously through Clearhead, we provide you referrals for people who are either looking at their financial situation from a long-term planning perspective, or people who are really struggling. So it'd be good to kind of have you kind of give us very practical examples of the common things that you see, and then we can talk about solutions after.
Of course. And yes, I will start with the legalese, or the disclaimer, is that we're going to talk about a bit today, and as much as we can squeeze in, or I'm going to talk about as much about what I can within the hour, but none of this is personalized financial advice. So it does come with the caveat that if you're going to make decisions based on this conversation, you're going to take actions following it, that please go out and ask someone to provide advice specific to your financial situation and the rest of your life situation as well. So yes, legal piece done. What are the three common situations that I see and that come through from the work that I do with people via Clearhead? It fits into three camps and three really recurring themes. The first is, because of our high inflation environment, costs have gone up, and in most cases wages haven't gone up by the same rate. So it's become more expensive to live, and so people just need some help trying to balance the books a bit there and trying to make things work. Then the second situation is almost an extension of that of, well, it's become a bit more expensive to live, but I've got this mortgage, and this mortgage is quite big, and it's about to roll off, or it has just rolled off whatever term it was on, and it was probably on something like a 2, 3 or 4% term, interest rate, and it's about to roll on to maybe 6 or 7%. What do I do? How am I going to get through this, and what's the size of the problem? And then the third group of people is those that have got these two things under control already. So it might be that they paid off their mortgage, and so there isn't a mortgage to worry about, and their income is large enough to cover their living costs, and they're perhaps aggressively saving as well, and might be much more financially well established. But they've got concerns or stresses that are related to long-term things, and those are things like, well, okay, I'm creeping towards retirement. Do I have enough? How do I know when I've got enough money to retire? Can I retire early? Can I not? Or other aspirations in their lives, like, okay, I've got adult children. How can I help them into housing? And what's the way to do that? And how much can I support them without compromising on my own financial future?
Oh, no pressure. Everybody will look at all of what you've just described and probably identify themselves in 1, 2, or 3 buckets, basically. And it reflects in little things like you don't get to travel for as long, or you don't get to eat out as often, and people having to be much more considerate around their financial situation. And of course, we kind of don't want to get into this downward spiral where you use debt to service your lifestyle. And then obviously with increasing interest rate, there's not just mortgage, but also your credit card bills, etc. So Adam, maybe you could kind of help us work through maybe the first bucket that you've talked about, where it is getting really hard to just balance the books, even if you don't have a mortgage weighing on your bank account, and what to do in the context of people feeling like they can't see a way out other than to just incur more debt.
Yeah. And if you're in a situation where the day-to-day financial is the thing that's right in front of you and is causing you stress. Undoubtedly, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to create a budget. And there'll be people on this call who have budgets, and I don't want to teach you to suck eggs by saying, do something different. If you've got something that works for you, fantastic. But lots of people don't, and lots of people need to create something to help them balance the books, especially in the short term. And actually, just on financial stress, before diving into a bit of a chat about budgeting, I want to just say it is really real. And there was a study done by Harvard and a host of other universities back in about 2013. And what that study showed was that there's a level of cognitive impairment that comes with being really worried about money. And the benchmark was the equivalent level of cognitive impairment is something like 13 IQ points. So if you have got money weighing on your mind, it's going to bleed through to other aspects of your life. It's going to make work that little bit harder, or it's going to make relationships that little bit more complicated. And it's just has lots of impacts. And to put a 13 basic IQ point change into perspective, that's about the equivalent of missing a whole night's sleep. And if you think about how bad you feel after skipping a whole night's sleep, generally, it's pretty bad. So it's important to get things right. And when we talk about budgets and trying to do something, well, there's two common reasons that a budget might fail.
Yeah, and Adam, actually, just to briefly touch on your point as well, is, and because it will reflect on the budgeting side of things, is, I think what also happens when people are financially stressed is they get into this sense of scarcity as well. And so they don't make the best long-term decision making, and instead make much more short-term decision making, which I guess would be good to be mindful of as well when we think about the budgeting side of things, which I'm sure you'll cover. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But there's a pragmatism that if the short-term challenge is the big challenge for you, well, that's the one that you need to focus on. And you've got to get through that piece. So you've got to make decisions as best you can about the short term first before often you can think about the long term. And if I just talk about the common reasons that a budget might not work before saying what I think you might want to do, is that common reasons that budgets fail is, one, they're too complicated. So let's say you get out following this discussion, you go and build a spreadsheet, you spend a couple of hours building that spreadsheet, and you create this obligation to go and type in, okay, here's how much I spent on Uber this week, and here's how much Netflix was, and here's how much my new toothbrush was, whatever it may be, that you don't build something that takes you an hour to complete each week. It'll take you, a month or two, and you'll be sick of it, and you'll just stop paying attention to it. Then the second reason that budgets tend to fail is that they're too restrictive, or they compromise on your lifestyle too much. And to talk to what you said before, Angela, one of the things that's easiest to cut for most people is, not going out to restaurants if they're going out to restaurants, lots of discretionary spending on takeaway coffees and things. But if you're a socialite and you're going out 4 times a week to have dinner with friends or family at restaurants, to go from that to cold turkey and not have any dinners out for the next year, you're going to find such a big shift in your lifestyle that you feel pretty uncomfortable about it, and probably stop with the budget again as well. So important to let a little bit of lifestyle actually happen if you can with the financial constraints that you've got, because if you don't, the thing won't work. And I see I've still got the talking stick, which is good. Thank you, Angela. And so what does that mean? If you've got, what do I suggest when it comes to putting a budget in place? Well, with those two caveats, and that there are lots of different ways to do this. There are apps, there are spreadsheets, some people use pen and paper. One of the things that I often talk to with people via Clearhead is the idea of something called the grandma's jam jars approach. And yeah, it's a little bit quaint. But it's been around for a long time, and lots of financial commentators talk about something similar to that. And I've got an analog, nice. I'll turn myself this way for a second just to talk through what it is. And there's a story that goes with this as well of grandma is, she's a happy, healthy pensioner. She's your grandma in this case, and she gets a pension check that's her only income for, the month, and that's what she needs to live on. It arrives by post. She gets it. In fact, let's say it arrives as cash. She gets $1,000 each month, and she knows that that's what she's got to live on until next month when the next pension payment arrives. And so she has 3 jars, and those 3 jars, first, she has a monthly payment jar. This is for her fixed expenses. So that's things like her mortgage payments or a rent, if she's renting. It's her power bill. It's her telephone bill, because she's probably still got a landline, which I know lots of people don't now. But fixed expenses that aren't going to change. And she can go through and say, well, actually, because these don't change, I know that they cost $500 of my $1,000 per month. And then from there, what she does is she sets aside $200, which is the amount that she's calculated that she can save, and puts it into her rainy day fund. And that's for the future. That's either her savings, or it's preparing for emergencies that come up, like the car needs new tires or the roof needs repairing. Or in fact, it could be Christmas presents for you because you're an expensive lot to buy Christmas presents for. And so she sets money aside in here, $200. And what that leaves is $300 for weekly expenses for her to spend. And so this is where it should cover things like her grocery bill. It should cover things like her petrol. It should cover things like her enjoyment, and eating out and entertainment are all things that should be budgeted for as part of this. And the trick with a system like this, although it's very simple, is that when the $300 runs out in this one, she knows, or in fact, as it's getting closer to running out, she knows that she has to make some financial decisions about not going out or not spending as much on groceries until the next paycheck arrives. And most of us don't get paid in cash anymore. In fact, I'd say probably all of us. Most of us also don't have jars that have cash sitting in them. So what's the modern equivalent of this? The modern equivalent is to essentially have 3 bank accounts, or something similar to 3 bank accounts, where your pay all goes into one. Then you have automatic payments tied up related to all the things that come out, and you want them to come out roughly very shortly after it is that you get paid. Then another automatic payment that sets aside money for rainy days, and then another automatic payment that sets you up for your weekly spending. And that's generally the one that your day-to-day card might be attached to.
That sounds really good. I'm like fascinated by the grandma jam jars. So do you have any sort of, if we sort of dig a little bit more with the nuance in this context, so let's just say with the rising costs, that obviously affects both the monthly side of things as well as the weekly discretionary spend. And so if in that case, they have to pay the stuff that's in the monthly stuff, and they've already reduced as much discretionary spend as possible while not sort of having a lifestyle that would be unbearable, then the money still is the same amount. Would you then suggest that they cut into the saving side of things? Yeah, how would you kind of slice and dice this piece of equation when you have a piece of string that hasn't extended, basically?
Yeah. It's very hard to talk about that, because there'll be lots of different people listening to this with lots of different financial situations, and undoubtedly, budgeting in a nutshell, or your income and your expenses in a nutshell, is a simple thing to do. Yeah, work out how much income you've got, And that can be pretty hard to change. Often it means, well, I need to change job if I want to change the amount of income I've got. Or if you're a homeowner, maybe it means taking on a new flatmate, or it means starting a side hustle, or whatever that may be. And it tends to be the expenses side of the equation is the easiest one to make some decisions with and change how it is that you're spending and be a bit more strategic, whether that be shopping at a different supermarket or eating out less of the nice easy ones. But going through, depending on your situation, going through line by line of each of the different expenses that you've got and working out whether they're things that you need, things that you want, or things that maybe you don't need and don't really want, and trimming those first. The hardest part about this exercise of going, okay, there's 3 buckets here or 3 jars here, is working out, well, how much can I afford to put into each of these things? And the tool that I often recommend here, and there's lots of different tools, is one called Budget Flow. If you just go to budgetflow.co.nz, it's a free website set up by, in fact, a developer in Wellington that built a budgeting tool for himself and went, this might be good enough to share with other people. And why I like it is it's really simple and easy to use. It prompts you as to things that you might be spending your money on, and you can compare it against your bank statements. But at the bottom, it'll spit out a set of numbers that says, well, here's roughly what you should be putting towards your monthly expenses based on what you've put into the calculator. And here's what you should be putting towards savings, and here's what you should be putting towards your weekly expenses too.
Amazing. Well, let's tackle the next big bucket, which is mortgages. That's for many people on the call. They probably are affected by rising interest rates and the doubling of interest payments, for example. So, what are you seeing in terms of what are the challenges associated with this, and what are the common advice that you've kind of shared?
Yeah. And where to start on this one? Look, it's the reality of the situation is that mortgage rates have doubled or tripled for lots of people in the last few years. And why I wanted to talk about all that context at the front of, the central bankers weren't right on the economic predictions, the media wasn't right, the politicians, no one was able to predict the future. And so why I bring that up now is that if you're a person who's in a situation where you've got a mortgage and that mortgage is causing you some problems, there's not much you could have done other than have a magic crystal ball in front of you to be able to make a decision different to what it was that you did, because everyone was saying we're going to be in a long, slow economic recovery and interest rates are going to be slow for a long time, or low for a long time. And so that's one aspect. It's not your fault, essentially. Would have been really hard to make other decisions. And then the second thing that talking to some of my clients outside of Clearhead here, they tend to be those that have established, a bit of wealth over time, and some of them are older as a consequence of that. And their benchmark is, well, back in the 1980s, interest rates were 20 or 21 or even higher. 7% doesn't seem that bad by comparison. But actually, the economic circumstances are entirely different, as is the rate of change. To go from, I live in Auckland, to go from 2% or 2.5% to something like 7% or 6% on a mortgage, and some people have $1 million mortgages, that's $40,000 a year of interest cost change that you've had within a very short period. So first, it's not your fault. Second, would have been really hard to predict. And yes, it's a reality. But what do you need to do, or what can you do? Well, the first part comes back to just having a budget, and a budget that works. But what you need to do is factor in, well, when do my interest rates change, and how much are they going to change, and what's the size of the mountain that I need to scale, because I need to know the size of the problem before I can go about fixing it. And once you know the size of the mountain, And if it looks like a big mountain, undoubtedly the best thing that you could do is bring in a mortgage expert. And it's probably your mortgage expert, and that would be, the bank that helped you set up the mortgage in the first place, or your mortgage broker, if that was who set up your mortgage in the first place. They're there as experts to try and help you navigate what you're going through or about to go through. And if there's a silver lining, and it's a thin silver lining, is that you're not in this alone. As of March this year, roughly 50% by value of all mortgages in New Zealand were going to roll off in the next 12 months. And that's a lot of mortgages, and that's a lot of people going through a really significant change in their interest rates. But if I'm not a mortgage expert, and I do think you should talk to a mortgage expert if you're in this situation and things are looking a bit tough. But if you want to talk about some of the possible options that might be in front of you, well, if you're at a low interest rate now and you're going to move to a higher interest rate, then trying to pay down as much of the mortgage as you can before you move to the next interest rate might make a big difference to the amount that you need to pay, as is talking about the idea of extending the term of your mortgage so that the payments become a bit smaller, or perhaps, and this won't be an option for everyone, shifting to interest-only mortgages so that the payments shrink even further. And in more extreme cases, it might even lead to considering the idea of downsizing on your house so that the mortgage is more tenable. That's on the expense side. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I know that, Angela. On the income side, some people, not many, but some might have a spare bedroom or a spare sleep out, and considering the idea of renting out those spaces might just be another way of creating some form of income that helps meet the mortgage payments. But any of those things that I just mentioned, and there'd be lots more if you talk to your bank or to a mortgage broker, they all have consequences, and some of those are really long-term consequences. So really encourage everyone to go and talk to the expert and work out what their options are, and if they need any of those options before they make any decisions.
Yeah, and that's super helpful to know that it doesn't have to be, you just have to accept doubling your interest payments overnight once the term sort of rolls off. So I guess at the back of people's mind is like, is this just a temporary pain? I mean, I don't believe so. I think if anything, what we were before, where interest rates were almost non-existent, especially globally, where interest rates were zero, if not negative, I think it's an unusual period that I think a lot of economists have not even sort of factored before. So I think people are still sort of potentially holding on to this fact that things will get back to what it was before, where money is a little bit easier flowing. What's your perspective on, how you sort of mentioned, planning that mountain? Can I plan for interest rates to come back down? Yeah.
Wow. And if anyone does have that crystal ball on the call, feel free to send it through to me very rapidly in advance of answering this question. But look, if I am rubbing the crystal ball and making predictions, do I think that we'll be back at a point in time where we have 2 or 2.5% interest rates in the near future? No, not at all. If I were looking for a marker of what might interest rates be, the Reserve Bank has come out and turned off that cold tap because they think that hopefully we've reached peak inflation. We might be, if you look at the market commentary, might be close to peak interest rates now, but who knows for sure. And the best marker that you could use right now, I would say, is looking at the fixed rates that the banks are offering and seeing how much the drop is as you take a longer term view of mortgages. And the drop's not that much really when you factor in where we were 3 years ago. So it feels a bit like a politician's answer of, have I answered it directly? Are we going to get down really, really low again? Not unless something seismic happens. Is it going to drop a little bit? That seems to be the market commentary, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this space by any means.
Yeah, so I think the main thing to consider is when you're doing your planning, to plan the interest rates as is now rather than expecting interest rates to halve again in 6 months' time. I think it's
That's
best to
right.
kind of be practical around this. And look, I think that hashtag gender equality, women are now becoming the breadwinner, and when especially of those who are of the age to have a mortgage or be the breadwinner, they generally are also at a child rearing age. And so what sort of are the recommendations that you have for those who are planning to go on unpaid maternity leave for, say, a year? They might have some savings, but it's quite difficult with sort of being on unpaid maternity leave, even though there might be some savings. There's obviously, you could consider maybe taking, reducing sort of like your saving side of things, whether that's the compulsory Kiwi Saver side of things. Yeah. How would you frame helping people go on to unpaid maternity leave for at least 1 to 2 years in the context of this, and they're the breadwinner?
Mm. There's a lot to think about in that, and most people that are approaching that point in their lives hopefully are thinking about it. So you do get some payment from the government, although in most cases it will be less than what your wages are. So you get a little bit of financial support from the government, but not that much relative to your income. The things that you might think about as part of that is, how big is your war chest in terms of your savings? How long can you stay off work? And different families will make quite different decisions about how long you spend at home with your child versus when you go back to work to earn an income again, or an increased income again. You'd also want to think about the costs of childcare and some of the different options for childcare. Kindergartens can be pretty cost effective, but they have their limitations in terms of the number of hours that they are generally open, and they also have generally aren't open during school holidays. So that means that every 10 weeks or so, there's a 2-week period where you have to work out, well, what are we doing? Whereas daycare facilities are considerably more expensive than that, but they they do stay open during those periods. And then we do live in a modern world from the perspective of who can be the primary earner and who can be the primary caregiver as well. So we had periods in our household when our children were born where I was the primary caregiver for a period. My wife was the primary caregiver for the earlier stages, and I've got similar with colleagues here where they've done what would traditionally be considered the gender role reversal. But I think for most people now, that's sort of gone out the window as the decision-making factor for when you are making those decisions. So it's a go in eyes wide open, knowing that it's going to be expensive. And I have no doubt, rightly or wrongly, that because of the economic circumstances that we're in, that some people have smaller families than what they otherwise might have, because you do still need to afford a place to live and have enough bedrooms for the family that you've got as well. But make the best decision that you can, and also acknowledge that if you are having children, and you own a house, you're probably going to be at the natural life stage of close to peak debt, because that's what tends to happen at that point in time, and you're going to have this quite considerable income drop.
And those are really great suggestions as well to consider, really leaning on other support systems that are available for you. And obviously, in multi-generational families are also another way to think about, being able to rely on childcare that doesn't take up most of your paycheck. And look, let's move on to the next part of the final bucket that you talked about, which is, okay, I'm at the stage where I'm nearing retirement. And I thought I had enough money saved, but now with the increased cost of living, etc., I'm not even sure if I could retire when I thought I could, or so maybe could you talk through the final bucket in terms of what are the challenges you see them facing and what are the recommendations you've provided?
Yeah, of course. And financial stress, as the topic of the webinar, can affect anyone. So to pick a few kind of extreme examples of cases where I'm working with someone now, is I've got someone who has had a significant unexpected inheritance, and all of a sudden she's got this money and needs to make some decisions on it, and hasn't had to deal with this before. And the same for someone who's just sold a business. But if you're in a situation where, look, the mortgage is under control, or it's gone because you've managed to pay it off, and you've got more than enough income to cover you for your short-term expenses, and those stresses are, they've dissipated, or at least they're much smaller than they might otherwise be. You're in a situation where you're able to think a bit more about the long term, and that does become the more stressful factor. And so the examples that I mentioned before of, well, how do I know when I've got enough to retire, or how will I know when I'm getting towards that amount, and how much do I need to be able to do other things as part of my life later on, like support my children into housing or provide for annual holidays for the family or the like. In terms of what our business at Rutherford Rede has been built around, it's mostly been built around looking after those sorts of clients. And the tool that we use here is building a long-term financial plan for people, which is going through and calculating interest, their expenses and income, projecting out what investment returns might be over a period, and trying to basically line up aspirations in life with the financial map of your life as well, so that you can make some bigger decisions now based on where you might be going with, in the future. So we do that. But if you're trying to do something along those lines yourself, one of the best places to start would be sorted.org.nz. They've got some great calculators that can tell you, okay, how am I tracking on my savings, particularly how am I tracking on my KiwiSaver, and am I going to get to a point where I might have enough? And then the other tool that I often recommend if you want to go deeper into some of the detail is that Money Hub has got some quite good articles on it to talk you through some of those things. The caveat that I would have, though, is that going through and building a long-term financial plan, particularly one that takes all of your circumstances and all of your aspirations into account, requires quite a depth of knowledge about investment markets and about financial products in general. So that's another situation where I generally say, you might be wise to get some professional advice here, but if you want to go out and start doing something on your own, sorted.org, which is a government-built website, is a really great starting point.
Amazing. And, obviously we talked in the context of the challenges that people generally face and the recommendations that you've provided. Maybe could you give us a couple of examples of when people don't take those advice, and when people do take those advice, what the difference in trajectory looks like?
Oh, yes, I can. Let me think through. I'm just mindful of confidentiality as that's what I'm
Oh, yes.
about.
Yeah. Nothing that would be identifiable.
No. And if I think about, so maybe we talk through each of those in turn, but if you part of building a budget, even if someone like me or a professional is helping, a lot of it is self-led. Ultimately, you're the one that goes out with the card and goes and buys what you need to, and buys what maybe you don't need to as well. So thinking of an example of someone that it was really hard for them to actually put these controls in place, and they hadn't had any spending controls in place, as an adult earning an income. And if I step back a little bit further, you've got to acknowledge that most of the time, for most of us, financial aspects of life weren't taught at school. So it's, a little bit of that is changing, but it's a lot of stuff that you don't learn until you need to know it. I can think back to us buying our first house and being absolutely terrified of the process because I'd never done it before. It was a massive financial decision. The real estate agent wasn't on my side. The bank wasn't on my side. Who was on my side? It was just me and my wife and us trying to make really good decisions and under a stressful environment. So come back to that example. It was someone who needed to put something in place, but found that it actually had to get really, really bad and identify how big and bad the problem was and what the long-term consequences of that were going to be before she could put something in place. And so what that meant was talking through, well, if your aspiration is a house deposit and you don't have a budget or you don't have a system in place that's going to help you save, well, the chances of you actually saving for a house deposit and having a house that you own on your own is about zero, or very close to zero. So that's one example. If I talk about mortgages, we are where we are economically, and everyone that's on the call will be in their own situation. If we look back, the property market got pretty hot, or very hot, I should say, not to understate it, and the ability to buy a house, if you were trying to, you had to extend yourself, or it felt like you had to extend yourself and get tangled up in a bit of the hype of the market. And so there were a couple of people that I had talked to where the question was, actually, are you going to be better off looking at the interest rate obligations and the mortgage obligations that you're going to have versus renting? And that really ties to people's aspirations in life as well. So if you're someone in a situation where you're thinking about buying a home, but you're also thinking about, well, maybe I'll go and live overseas for a couple of years and do an OE. Well, does it make sense to take on a big mortgage at the same time as one of these other possibilities of life trajectory is being contemplated too? And just trying to tie your aspirations for what you want to do with your life to what it is that you make your financial decisions based on. And then, so on the last example of those that are actually at a more financially established stage in their life, that's the decisions become those, and just using retirement as the example of going through and saying, well, if we can run the calculations, are you able to get something that can tell you whether you're able to retire or not? Well, then, great, you can make a call based on that. And one of my first clients when I started with Rutherford Rede was someone who was in this situation. Well, we're selling a house in Auckland. We're thinking of moving elsewhere. Are we going to have enough? We're thinking about retirement in the future. We went through and ran the calculations and with a professional opinion said, yes, you can actually retire tomorrow if you want to. And she's still working. And that's because there are some non-financial benefits of being at work, like social life and purpose and all the other things that are really important in life, or many of the other things that are really important in life, that finance and money is just a tool to help you enable.
Nice. And, one of the questions people might have is like, in the circumstances of preventing yourself from getting into a bad state financially, does insurance matter in any of this? Like, is there insurance you can buy to kind of get yourself out of these sticky situations, or is that not really a thing?
Oh, no, of course. That's exactly what insurance is there for. And the insurance spectrum is quite broad, but if we use a house or a car as an example of that, well, if something happens to your house or your car, well, unless you've got insurance that covers it and something happens, like your house burns down or your car gets stolen, well, you're going to have to find another way to pay for it. And so those are some general insurance examples. The ones, what you want to do if we talk about a long-term financial plan is work out where you want to go and how you want to get there, and then put all the pieces in place to make it so that if something might come along and stop you from getting there, that you're protected. And the insurances that you might think about from that perspective is, well, okay, I've got a spouse or I've got children. Maybe I should be considering life insurance because I'm the primary earner. Well, all of a sudden my income stops and all my obligations remain, particularly if I've got a mortgage as well. Or income protection because my income stops, or disability insurance or trauma, which are essentially if some kind of health event happens to me, how does the income keep on coming into my house? But yes, there's a plethora of different kinds of insurances that make a big difference. But they all come at a cost and a trade-off of, well, I'm guaranteed to pay premiums. Am I guaranteed to have some of these events that come up? And working that out. And an insurance specialist would be the one to go to help you answer that question.
Nice. And obviously you mentioned that knowing how to where to invest, etc., requires some level of professional opinion. But obviously we are trying to also get to a state where not everybody can get access to those professional opinions. So did you have, I guess, any sort of high level principles to apply in the context of investment? Is it just that should you just put it in a ETF fund, or should you bump up your KiwiSaver? Like, how do you think about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'm imagining the lawyers breathing down my neck as I attempt to answer this one. I would say 99% of the people on this call will be an investor one way or another, and that's because KiwiSaver is investments. And a lot of people don't know what they're invested in, but a starting point would be finding that out. And to talk in really general terms, so the lawyers don't get me in trouble here, the decisions that you need to make around investments and using KiwiSaver as the example is, well, there's one, diversification, generally accepted that, you want to have your eggs in lots of baskets. Don't put all your money in Rocket Lab, because Rocket Lab might do this and Rocket Lab might do this, and it'll be a pretty wild ride along the way. So what you want to do is invest in something that invests in lots of things, and most KiwiSaver providers do that and do that reasonably well. Then the other thing that you need to factor in is your time frame. If you're going to withdraw for a house purchase in the next couple of years, well, you don't want an investment that bounces around like this. You probably want something that's going to be stable and boring and not do much, because you're going to need that money for a deposit. And what you don't want is to walk into a situation where you've invested in some risky things and then they're not there, or the values massively drop just as you go and place an offer on a house. Whereas if you're thinking about long term and you're not going to touch the money for the next 30 years because you don't turn 65 and you can't actually access your KiwiSaver until after that point in time, well, what you would generally do is skew your mixed bag of investments towards growth things, like technical term, growthy things, which is things like shares and property, which are designed to grow faster over time, but have a pretty wild ride on the way there, and have less of what's known as incomey things, or income assets, which are things like bonds and cash that don't have as much of a wild ride, but they don't perform as well over the long term either. So understanding where your KiwiSaver is that's my go-to answer here. Where is your KiwiSaver? How's it invested? Which is, what asset allocation is the term used for how much is in growthy stuff and how much is in incomey stuff. And then if we talk about non-KiwiSaver investments, I hesitate before I say it, but the academic evidence definitely skews towards passive investments over active on average. If you look at what you pay for fees for an active manager versus a passive manager, and that's backed up by a lot of research, including the SPIVA research, which is Standard & Poor's.
Including the greatest investor of them all, Warren Buffett, right? He says that too. I think the passive.
Yeah. You might know about, do you know about his $1 million bet?
I'm sure you could share it with us.
Well, so famously, Warren Buffett, active or value investor, goes out, buys big stakes in businesses and holds them for a long time, but goes in and chooses individual companies, kind of what we would consider active investment. He was talking about ETFs and they're much lower cost. They generally, basically what you do is you hold all market or most of the market and just let the whole market do the work rather than picking individual companies. And he took $1 million bet with a hedge fund manager in the US to say that I think that $1 million or whatever it was of ETFs in the Standard & Poor's 500, which is the largest 500 companies in the US, will outperform your hedge fund over, I think it was a 10-year period, when you take into account fees. And hedge funds are generally expensive. And they called off the bet early because the standard, the S&P 500 had gone so much further than what the hedge fund had done. And then also quite famously inside this is that the hedge fund manager was what's known as a fund of funds. So it was a group who went and said, well, okay, we're going to choose 5 underlying hedge fund managers, and they're going to be the ones that invest the money, but we're going to pick the best ones of those, and they're going to do their thing. And they've got, essentially every option under the sun in terms of investment. They can buy shares, they can short shares, they can take wild positions if they want to. And each of the underlying fund managers all underperformed the S&P 500 over the period after fees as well. So it's a great example of why indexing has become such a popular form of investment.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think about when in the context of investment is just regularly putting a small amount rather than, like $5 a week every week, then sort of expecting to time the market and stuff like that. Because generally, similar to active investment, most people don't time the market very well either. That sounds good. Obviously, we can only cover so much. Is there any books you recommend reading for people to kind of get their head around any of the stuff that we talked about today that you think is pertinent for what it means to live in society in the 21st century?
Yes. Yeah, there are. Mary Holm is one of my go-to authors for, and why I think that she's really helpful is that she provides things with the New Zealand context. One of her books is a little bit older now, and I think she's just released a new one, but it talks through things that are related to New Zealand specifically. So KiwiSaver for a start, and New Zealanders' love of property that not every country in the world has, and some of the nuances of our insurance system and ACC and various other things. So my go-to would be that. If you were looking for something a bit more digital, Money Hub is a fantastic website in terms of the content that it has on most aspects of personal finances and provides lots of details in there as well. And then as a government-backed one, Sorted, as I mentioned before, is a great starting point for helping you understand various different points of finance.
Awesome. Any final sort of tips and tricks you want to share with us before we close off today's session?
Well, just there isn't a crystal ball would be the thing. It's really hard to predict the future. Just play. You've got to play the hand you've dealt, and you've got to deal with the personal financial position that you're in right now. So, make informed decisions, get advice or research, and talk to the people that you feel like can help you. So if you're in a mortgage situation where it's looking pretty tough in the near future, talk to someone that can help you with mortgages and make that a mortgage specialist. And if you are struggling with budgeting and making ends meet, there's lots of services out there as well that can help you with that. And if you're more established financially, talk to someone, get advice, make sure that you make the right decisions because they have a huge impact on all the other aspects of your life. And then financial wealth is only one aspect of your wealth as well. And as you get older, you discover that. It's pretty high and mighty of me to say that, but at some point in time, your health is going to become more important than your money, and your family is going to become more important than your money, and your relationships are going to become more important than your money, and your experiences are all going to become more important than your money. And these are all different aspects of your personal wealth that you need to try and strike the best balance that you can between.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. It's been super helpful. Hopefully, we demystify some of the things that people are struggling with, and that you're not alone if you are, that there is professional help available. Usually, potentially, your workplace will provide some sort of financial support, or EAP providers like Clearhead does as well. So don't suffer in silence. I know that money can cause people to feel really unhappy and really stressed. But really, what Adam's tried to share is there is so many steps you can take. Don't get overwhelmed. And often it does require a bit of a personalized approach, depending on all the different nuances in your circumstances. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Adam, for sharing his many, many wisdom with us. Okay, take care. Bye.